Clause 15. Practical completions and defect liability. We have 6 sub-clauses here, quite a lot of informations. Within some sub-clauses, there are sub-components. The relevant statements you can refer to the PAM contract. For simplicity, let us look at this slide. First, what is practical completions? The works are considered practically complete when the employer can have full use of the work for their intended purpose. As the term practically complete implies, the building structures as delivered by the contractor will need to function properly as per the intended purpose. Architect will need to determine whether the structures is practically completed. These practical completions does not include those minor works or minor defects which will not affect the functionality of the structure. Those minor works and minor defects can be rectified after the practical completions without disturbance to the employer if the employer decided to possess the structure. That means these kinds of works and defects shouldn't be significant enough to influence the functionality of the structure. According to the PAM contract, the architect will need to confirm the structures is practically complete before issuance of the certificates of practical completions. The practical completions is not declared by the contractor. It shall be officially declared by the architect by issuing the certificate of practical completions. Now, what is the certificate of practical completions? It is also known as the CPC. It is issued when the works are practically completed within 14 days that the contractor given written notice to the architect that the work is practically completed. The architect will need to do the inspections and decide whether the works is practically completed or not practically completed. These are a few possible scenarios as the outcome of the inspections by the architect. Let's say now the contractors have completed the work. He would like to claim for the certificates of practical completions. He submit written notice to the architect requesting the architect to come and do the inspections. With that, the architect come and inspect the structures, and within 14 days, if the structures is okay, CPC will be issued. Let's say now in the opinions of the architect, the works is not practically completed. The architect will need to give written notice stating the reasons. Where are the areas not properly completed? The written notice needs to send a copy to the nominated subcontractor if the works is related to the nominated subcontractor. That means if architect finds it is not practically completed, no CPC will be issued. Instead, there will be a written notice asking the contractor to rectify the pending works. Next, if in the opinions of the architect it is practically completed, the architect will need to issue the CPC. However, there is slight difference in terms of the date of this CPC, depending whether there are still minor works or defects to be rectified. Let's say now everything goes smoothly. That means the contractor completed the work nicely. The structures is functional, is able to be used for the intended purpose, and there are no works or defects detected which require the contractor to rectify. That means the entire structures is now clear, and the architect will issue the CPC dated based on the dates of the contractor's written notice. With that, the entire work settled. However, if there are still minor works and defects that require the contractor to rectify, the CPC should be held until the contractor sends a written notice promising to undertake the making good and to complete the works and defects. That means the contractor will need to promise to make good and rectify the remaining works as well as the defects which are deemed to be minor and not affecting the practical completions. Once the contractor sends in the written undertaking for those work, the CPC will be dated as per the date of the receipt of the written notice from the contractor. When the architect issues the CPCs to the contractor, he will need to submit a copy to the employer and also the nominated subcontractor. That means all the parties involved should be made known regarding the state of the project which has already been practically completed. As the employer receives the CPC, that means the employer can gain possession of the site and the handing over process can be executed. Now let us look at the flowchart here, which summarizes the process here. It starts with the contractor completing the work. The contractor then submits a written notice to the architect. The architect will do the inspections. There are two possible outcomes. If the work is not practically completed, the architect will need to issue notice of incompletions. The notice is to be given to the contractor and send a copy to the nominated subcontractor. Let's say now the work has been practically completed. The architect will need to observe if there are minor works or defects which require the contractor to rectify. If there is minor works and defects, the CPC will be on hold. Wait for the notice of undertaking the rectification work by the contractor. The dates of the CPC will be as per the date of receipt of this notice of undertaking. Let's say now there are no minor works and defects. Then the architect can directly issue the CPC. The date of the CPC, it will be as per the date of the notice sent to the architect. Based on the clause here, the CPC will need to be issued within 14 days that the contractor submit the notice. That means this entire process here will have to be completed within 14 days. If the work is practically completed and the architect decided to issue the CPC, at the same time, we'll need to send a copy to the employer and also the nominated subcontractor. This is to ensure them are also being informed. And with the CPC, the employer can gain possessions of the structures or site. Next, what if the contractors fail to comply with the undertaking of the pending works as well as the minor defects? We mentioned just now, if there are works and defects, the contractor will need to undertake those and to make good of those. The relevant works and defects will need to be specified. and the contractor will need to attend to the works within the specific time. Let's say now if the contractor fails to rectify those within the stipulated time, the employer can choose one of the following, responding to the failure of the contractors to comply with the undertaking. First, the employer can choose to grant additional time to the contractor so that the contractor can rectify the work, and this is considered as a favor given by the employer to the contractor. This is not compulsory to the employer, but in case that the employer chooses to give favor in terms of the additional time, the employer can do so. Then the contractor can make good use of this additional time to finish up the rectification works. Or the employer has the right to pay for another person to do the work. The cost, it will be on the contractor. The employer can offset the relevant costs from the payments to the contractor. The third option is the employer can accept the work or defect without rectifications, and the contractors do not need to proceed with the rectification work. However, there will be an appropriate offset due to the relevant works and the defects. The amount to be offset are normally more or less equivalent to the cost that's supposed to be paid to another person for the rectification works. Next, we talk about the schedules of defects. First, what is the schedule of defect? It is a list of the defect as identified by the architect or the employer, which is not in accordance with the contract, that are found during the defect liability period. DLP stands for the defect liability period. Now, what is the defect liability period? This is the period which the contractor will need to guarantee that there are no defects of the work delivered to the employer after completion of the work. That means once the project is handed over to the employer, the defect liability period will start. It is normally in the range of 12 months. Within these 12 months, there shouldn't be any defects of the work. If there are any defects, the architect will list out the defects in the schedules of defects, give it to the contractor, and the contractor will need to rectify those defects. It is like a warranty period to the employer regarding the work delivered by the contractor to the employer. Now let us come back with the schedules of defect. These schedules of defect will be specified by the architect related to the defects of the works which is not in accordance to the contract that appears within the defect liability period. And these schedules of defect will need to be delivered to the contractor within 14 days after the expiry of this defect liability period. After the defect liability period ended, as long as the schedules of defects is delivered within 14 days, the contractor will still need to rectify it. If the schedules of defects is sent after 14 days, the contractors have the right not to entertain it. Now let's say the contractors have received the schedules of defect. That means the contractors is required to make good of the defect. and this will need to be done within 28 days after he have received the schedules of defects. And all the rectification works will be on the cost of the contractor. The employer do not need to pay for the relevant work since the works are not in accordance to the standards as per specified in the contract. The contractor will need to take the full responsibility of it. Now, if the contractors fail to rectify those or choose not to rectify it, the employer can employ another person to do the rectification work. The relevant cost will be offset from the payment. That means the cost will still be imposed onto the contractor. There is another option. If the contractors does not rectify the defect, the architect may instruct the contractors to leave the defect as it is, and this will require the consent of the employer. That means the employer will need to agree that the relevant defects are left without being made good. However, there will be deductions in terms of the payments by the employer to the contractor. Now let us reorganize the information here. The schedules of defect is issued by the architect. It identifies all the defects found during the defect liability period. As long as the schedules of defects reach the contractor during the defect liability period or within 14 days after the defect liability period expired, the contractor will need to make good of those defects. The cost will be fully paid by the contractor, and those work needs to be done within 28 days as the schedules of defects reach the contractor. If the contractor choose not to rectify or fail to rectify within the specific periods of time, there are 3 options that the employer can do, which is either to grant extra time as a favor to the contractor for the contractor to rectify, or to pay another person for the work, and the cost will be charged to the contractor by setting off the payment. Or the employer can accept the defect without rectifications, but the relevant cost will need to be offset from the payments to the contractor. Whichever defects as identified during the defect liability periods will be fully under the responsibility of the contractor, no matter which options that the employer choose. The relevant cost, it will be fully paid by the contractor. This will ensure the contractors to carry out the works carefully and deliver quality works. Next, we look at the certificates of making good defects. This certificate claims that the defects as per identified in the schedules of defect has been made good. That means has been rectified, and now the contractors is free from the liability of the relevant defects. So, upon completion of the rectification works of all the defects, the contractor will need to give a written notice to the architect stating that he have done the relevant task. Within 14 days, the architect will need to do the inspections, and there are 2 possible outcomes, which in the opinions of the architect, whether the relevant defects has been made good. Let's say now the contractors have done all the rectification works. That means no defects is observed by the architect, or the relevant defects has already been made good. The architect will issue the certificate of making good defects. The date of this certificate, it will be the dates when the architect received the contractor's written notice about completing the relevant works. This certificate of making good defects will be sent to the contractor, CC to the employer and the nominated subcontractors. That means everybody is being informed regarding the completions of the rectification work. Now, let's say that the defects has not been fully rectified, or the relevant works are not being undertaken. The architect will give a written notice to the contractor stating the reasons. Notify the area which is still not making good. This notice will need to be made additional copy to be sent to the nominated subcontractor. The principles here is similar to the case when the CPC is issued. If the CPC is issued, it needs to be CC to the employer and NSC. If it is not issued, it is only to be CC'd to the NSC, no need to inform to the employer. Same goes to the certificate of making good defect. If everything is cleared, it will need to be CC'd to the employer and the NSC. But if it is not cleared, the architect will only need to notify the NSC. No need to inform to the employer.